My colleague, Professor Judith Wolfe, has presented very interesting reflections on the relevance of theology in the modern university and in society. I found her considerations very stimulating and very interesting, starting from a traditional concept of understanding theology as the study of God and everything in relation to God, and then moving on to the two organizing concepts in her presentation, discovery and dwelling, in order to describe the role of theology in the university. One of the inspirations of Judith's presentation was for me to think about the role of theology in the university and in society, and to try to start from the other pole of the reflections, from the present state of society, and then move to the university and think what that might mean for Christian theology in the university. Now, if we think about today's society, one of the really dominant features that becomes immediately obvious is that we live in a very pluralistic society, a society that is characterized by a pluralism of religious views of life and philosophical views of life that live in a state of uneasy coexistence, sometimes competition and sometimes conflict. And what characterizes our society is that we're not quite clear whether we have any kind of common ground of values on which this debate is based, or whether we have rather a set of pluralistic, diverse, competing values and basic orientations of the life of the members of society. There are, of course, the major religions, the world religions, that have experienced a revitalization in the last 50 years. When I studied theology 50 years ago, the idea was basically that there would be a process of secularization that would be irreversible, global, and affect all areas of society. 20 years later, the religions made a big return. But not only the religions, but all kinds of other religiosities, mixtures of different traditions, philosophies of life, ideological views, compete for the attention of our societies. What can the role of theology be in such a situation for society? I think that Christian theology has a task of being a conversation partner in the debates of society, in the public sphere, about the common aims that we can develop for our societies. If we no longer have common ground, we need common aims for the good life of our societies, and we also need common rules that have to be observed in order to reach these common aims. Rules that are defined by non-violence, by peaceful exchange, by dialogue. If we look at the way in which Christian theology could work in such a situation, it would be by being an exemplary case how one basic orientation in society could turn critically and self-critically towards itself and ask itself, what can we contribute to the common good? Not just to the good for our particular churches and organizations, but for the common good of society. And the test of pluralism is always whether we can want that the others, with their other orientations, with their other convictions, can be part of our future. Now, if we turn to the university, we will see quickly that the university is also characterized by this pluralism. There is a pluralism of scientific methods, forms of inquiry, strategies of investigation in the sciences and in the humanities. And this pluralism is what makes the university work. There is no kind of unifying framework as we might have had it for some time in the medieval times, or perhaps even in parts of modernity where the emphasis on moving towards the future seems to have caught the attention of all academic disciplines. Now, one of the interesting features about that debate is that very often the programs of research our research questions and the main categories with which we work are not really scientific ones, and they're not really scholarly ones that would be the result of particular strategies of investigation. But they seem to be presupposed and belong to a kind of pre-scientific or meta-scientific category. In which direction we move in genetic engineering is dependent on the view we have of the perfectibility of human life. What does it mean to have perfection? And in all medical sciences, there is an idea of health which is not the result of scientific research, but which is already presupposed by the religious and philosophical convictions that people have. Now, these pre-scientific or meta-scientific attitudes play a large part in forming the categories with which we do research. What is the notion of freedom with which the neurosciences investigate human decision-making? Again, this is a notion that is presupposed. And it seems to me that it's one of the tasks of theology in the university to make these pre-scientific, meta-scientific attitudes, orientations in life, these kind of fundamental categories, the object of inquiry. And Christian theology does that by making Christian faith, the basic orientation of Christians, the subject matter of inquiry, by turning all its critical attention to what is closest to the heart of people, what makes them tick, what structures their lives. And therefore, I think the role of theology in the university is to provide a forum, a basis, where these pre-scientific or meta-scientific concepts and attitudes can be discussed that form the research programs, the research aims and goals in all parts of the university. And when theology can contribute to transforming our universities into dialogical institutions, that would be, I think, a huge gain for the universities themselves. Now, the question is, of course, how has theological to be done if it's to contribute to that conversation within the university? If theology is supposed to be the platform for an ongoing conversation of the university with itself. And it seems to me that one can try to formulate a number of rules, a bit of advice for Christian theologians, how they should conduct their business in the university. When I've thought about that, it seemed to me that there's no more obvious example of trying to develop that than the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, which we find in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy in the Bible, which for Judaism and for the Christian tradition, it's all, in all its varieties, has a particular significance. Would it be possible to develop rules, recommendations for how theology should be practiced in the university by borrowing from the Ten Commandments? Then, on second thoughts, this seemed to be rather restrictive. Who am I to issue commandments how theology should be done, to formulate rules for the good practice of theology? But then I remembered that one of my professors in Hebrew Bible had interpreted these Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus as reminders of retaining the freedom that the book of Israel, the people of Israel had just acquired in being liberated from bondage, from the slave house of Egypt. And I thought, well, if our reflection in response to Judith's presentation could focus on the permissions, the freedoms that are granted, allowed for theology, this might be a good way to bring the conversation forward. Now, the Ten Commandments don't start with a commandment, but they start with a self-presentation of God. I'm the Lord your God who led you out of Egypt, the slave house. And then it goes on to say, you shall have no other gods beside me. But I'm the Lord your God makes it quite clear that the one who speaks here is not on the side of the existing power structures, but is a liberating God who led Israel out of slavery. And therefore, this God, the God Jews and Christians believe in, is a God of promise, a God who brings with himself the promise of liberation for the flourishment of his people. Now, Christians would probably want to add, I'm the Lord your God who has brought you out of Egypt, the house of bondage. Another phrase by saying, I'm the Lord your God who raised the dead Jesus from the dead. And so bring the Christian content into the discussion by saying, if we want to know what liberation means, then the resurrection of the crucified Jesus is the best example of that. Now, it is this God, the God of promise, who turns us into creatures of promise, destined for flourishing and communion with God, who says, you shall have no other gods apart from me. Now, what can that mean in a modern university? I think basically it can mean that we assess critically and self-critically in whom we trust. Martin Luther interpreted this first commandment in the sense that he said, what you really hang your heart on, what you really trust, that is really your God. But then he added, and this trusting and the faith of the heart makes both God and idol. Trust is the glue of our societies. It's the way in which societies work, in the universities, in the churches, but also in business. Every contract has to be based on trust. The ways in which politicians are accountable to the electorate contains an element of trust. And therefore, it's tremendously important for us who we should trust in ultimately, fundamentally, and where our trust needs to be calibrated to the circumstances, needs to be critical trust. What the Decalogue says in its introduction basically is, you shall have no other God beside me. If you trust in me, you can be critical with regard to all those others who require your trust, who ask for your trust, and you can reflect critically whether they can really deserve it. It goes on to say, you shall have no graven image, and bow down before them and worship them. You shall have no idols. Now, at first this sounds very old-fashioned, but it seems to me that idol worship is a very acute problem in our societies, that there is a lot of idolatry around, and that graven images has become a mass industry. One can see that very often there are finite entities that demand our ultimate allegiance. It's not just the religions, but also what Paul Tillich called the quasi-religions, the nation in nationalism, in its new forms of populism. I think for many people, the market has become a kind of idol, a deity that is to be worshipped. Have you noticed then that when we watch the news on television, we sometimes hear sentences like, the markets reacted nervously to the political decision from Westminster. Market respond nervously, or if there's more positive news, optimistically? Can markets be nervous or optimistic? Surely not. But of course it shows that we have turned them into quasi-personalities of infinite power, which seem to govern our lives to a large extent. And one could also ask whether the way we present ourselves on social media is not also an attempt at self-idolization, making us more perfect than we really are, getting the shades right in our picture presentation that we have there. I think what theology can say in the university is, well, relax with regard to the idols. if you trust in God, the Creator, reconciler and perfecter of everything, the idols are reduced again to what they are, to mechanisms of communication, of interaction and exchange, like the market, that is dependent from our attitudes towards the market and doesn't determine our attitudes. You can relax. It was never a good idea for any people to make the nation the idol it follows. It was never a good idea for people and their flourishing to turn themselves into idols. So a critical view on the mass industry of graven images would be a contribution of the university, of theology to the university. But then there's the next commandment that says, you shall keep the Sabbath holy. Now in Judaism, this is a reminder that we didn't create the world. And therefore on one day of the week, it's necessary that human activity stops. And we are reminded that everything in which we live, everything which constitutes our being, the whole cosmos, is the result of divine activity. And so keeping the Sabbath makes us aware of the limits, the finitude of all human activity, of its fragility, its fallibility, its fallenness. Christians have interpreted this commandment as a commandment for worship on a Sunday, so that on one day in the week we try to focus on what is really important in our lives and relate to God in thanksgiving, petition, and lament in order to be quite sure how our life can be formatted by trust in God. Keep the Sabbath holy, reminding the university of the limits of human activity, of the limits of human perfectibility. Most of the most dreadful crimes in history have been committed in the name of the Superman, the Nietzschean Übermensch, or in the name of the perfect society in the future that allows you to make victims in the present. Now the next commandment is honor your father and your mother. That sounds even more old-fashioned, and one has to say theology is terribly old-fashioned compared to, say, modern social sciences or the natural sciences. I remember one scene when a friend of mine who worked in the social sciences looked at a paper I wrote and discovered that I was quoting literature from 1950, 1920, sometimes even from the 16th century. He said, how can that be? There's progress in scholarship. You should quote last year's paper. Theology quotes theological reflections from 2 centuries. We have a lot of fathers and mothers. Well, in fact, we're only discovering that we also have mothers. Lots of theologians in the history that were forgotten because they are female, because as women they contributed to the progress of theological reflection. Honor your father and your mother means that we can relate constructively to the traditions and discover their critical potential with regard to the way in which we do theology today. But honoring one's father or mother doesn't mean that one has to turn into them. It doesn't make one one's father. Therefore, this emphasis on cultivating traditions is in fact quite a critical principle, which makes it quite clear that every retrieval of the theology of past centuries is to be a resource for doing theology in the 21st century. If we read Thomas Aquinas today, we don't return to the 13th century, but we ask, are there possibilities for theological reflection that might make sense today in a very different context? It seems that the next commandment, you shall not commit murder, has nothing to do with life in the university. it's only in particular academic whodunits that a murder is actually committed in universities. But with regard to religion, one has to be a little more careful. We have known from bitter experience that religions can inspire people to the highest achievement, to the most wonderful works of art, but also seduce them to the most terrible crimes. And one of the tasks of theology in the university is to do its utmost to prevent religious beliefs from turning into violence, to offer that kind of critical reflection and that kind of theological consideration that prevents religion becoming violent. Every violence starts as symbolic violence, so that our choice of words really is extremely important in how we influence the conflicts in society. And our choice of words in theology should be focused on justice and peace, and not on inciting violence. With the next commandment, I'm really in trouble. You shall not commit adultery. Can we possibly translate that as you should not nail your theological colors to the mast of the most recent and most fashionable critical theory that you find around? You should not try to trust the other theories and the other sciences and humanities more than theological insight? Would that be a possible interpretation? I really don't know. It seems to me that in all kinds of interdisciplinary debates and discussions and research projects I was engaged in, the other representatives from the other scientists and the humanities wanted the theologians to be theologians and not demonstrate that they could also be social scientists or philosophers. So do not commit adultery as, so to say, the permission, the freedom to remain theological. I don't know whether that's a possible adaptation, but it's just a possibility to think about. Do not steal is the next commandment. One could say all kinds of things about plagiarism here. I think the whole thing that really is important in the university is that one should not appropriate the insights of others in such a way that it alienates them from their original context of inquiry and reflection. Do not steal. The next one, however, seems to be acutely relevant. Do not bear false witness. The last years we have discussed a lot about post-truth society. We have debated fake news, every party accusing the other one of producing fake news. And we have experienced that once the commitment to truth is bracketed in the conversations of society, there is only the sheer exercise of power that remains, a power that will eventually turn violent if it is no longer controlled by truth. And therefore, speaking truth to power is not only a good description of the work of the civil servant, but also one of theology in the university. Now, theology can only be a guardian of truthfulness in the university if it is radically self-critical with regard to the ways in which it has, in the past and in the present, compromised its commitment to truth. Now we come to the last two commandments. In most enumerations of the Decalogue, they are separated, but they only have one content: thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's servant, and so on. Two lists that are being offered here. What is that about? It seems to me that theology always involves the engagement in the formation of the affections of the heart. Judith has mentioned that in her presentation, in that theology is about the formation of persons. if we are asked what the products are that we as theology produce in the university, the only possible answer we have is educated persons. Now, the formation of persons includes the formation of our desires, calibrating the desires rightly, having finite desires for finite things, because we can measure them against the infinite God who alone deserves our infinite desire. It seems to me that our situation in society shows in many ways that the education of our desires is at the heart of remaining, of becoming ever more, of developing towards a society that values the virtues of conversation and exchange, that has respect for the dignity of each human person, and that therefore knows ways in which our desires can be redirected if they go in the wrong direction, can be criticized, and can be cultivated. If theology can contribute to that, it would not be a small service to the university. Now, these are my reflections in response to Judith. You see, that's an ongoing discussion, and I would be very keen to know what she thinks about this way of continuing her reflections, whether they can fit in her presentation of the task of the university, of theology in the university and in society, or whether she would persuade me to correct and modify my reflections and at a certain place. Theology, if it's good theology, is always theology in conversation. And I'm very much looking forward to that particular conversation.